Hello, my name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions.
And I'm Proven Paradox, a guy with a lot of questions.
And you're listening to Bright on Buddhism, a podcast where we discuss East Asian Buddhism, answering listener-submitted questions from listeners just like you, and introducing concepts of Buddhism that you may or may not be familiar with in a casual, conversational setting. Enjoy.
Here, if we have never known what it is like to be enlightened, how could we ever know we have become enlightened? It is like trying to search for a jewel, but we do not know the shape, size, weight, or color, or cut of it. And we could never know if the gem we found is the gem we're looking for.
I ask you, Hermit, what makes you so convinced we have never found that gem before?
I suppose it is because I experience desire, dissatisfaction, and delusion. If I were enlightened, wouldn't I no longer experience those things?
If enlightenment truly is a gem, as you say, then shouldn't it be possible to find it but then misplace it? If that were the case, we could have found it in a past life but misplaced it, and thus we would remember the shape, size, weight, color, and cut of it, and thus we would know to look for it in the future. I suppose that is why we study the teachings now, don't you?
That explains those who have found the gem before. What about those who haven't?
You are right that it would be difficult to find something you've never seen or touched before. I suppose then that everyone must have found their gem at some time or the other.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Bright on Buddhism. This week we will be discussing perhaps the most popular school of Buddhism in the West, Zen Buddhism. What is it? How does it differ from other Buddhist schools? What are its origins? And how does it reinterpret the earliest teachings? We hope you enjoy. So, what is Zen Buddhism and why are we talking about it?
We're discussing Zen Buddhism because it is one of the most widely known schools of Buddhism in the West. Most Westerners have heard of it, and it's even entered our colloquial speech. For example, when something or someone is very calm and tranquil, we often say that person or that thing is very Zen. However, the perception that many have of it is what I would call an essentialist view of Zen Buddhism. An essentialist view is taking only certain essential parts of something and ignoring the rest, and shaping your view and your discourse about it based on only those few things. A very biased view of Zen Buddhism. This view is due in part to how Zen arrived in the West, particularly into America. It was popularized by scholars like D.T. Suzuki and Soyen Shaku, who presented it and framed it as a modern rational philosophy on par with 19th century European philosophies in terms of rationality and reason. We've talked about how this is problematic in depth already in another episode where we talk about Buddhist modernism, but the short version is that this ignores an enormous amount of ritual practice and doctrinal points. So I would argue that the colloquial understanding of Zen is uninformed and shaped by this modern push by scholars in the 19th century. So what actually is Zen? Zen is the Japanese iteration of the Chinese Chan school of Buddhism, which is the Chinese iteration of a particular branch of early Buddhism in India centered around jhana meditation. Indeed, Zen is a Japanese transliteration of the Chinese word Chan, which is a Chinese transliteration of the Sanskrit word jhana. But all three of these words mean the same thing, a deep, absorptive, meditative state. Jhana meditation is a particular kind of meditation that differs from others we've talked about thus far. According to the jhana meditation doctrine, there are 4 deep meditative states, or jhanas. The first one is pleasure arising from overcoming unwholesome mental states and secluding oneself for the sake of practice. The second one is rapturous joy arising from concentration and awareness in the absence of discursive or discriminatory thought, when the first jhana is abandoned. The third is equanimity arising from awareness and non-attachment to the body and the environment, when the second jhana is abandoned. The fourth is purity and equanimity and mindfulness, when the third is abandoned. This structure of meditation is the early basis for Zen practice. As Zen developed in China, Korea, and Japan, the Zen doctrinal, practical, and ritual tradition blended and mixed with other Mahayana emphases, such as non-duality, emptiness, Buddha nature, and mind-to-mind transition of the Dharma.
I want to talk a little bit about one of the words we've used here, dhyana. So let's talk a bit about how that's spelled.
Yeah, it's important that you ask that because obviously on audio recordings and podcasts, it's hard to communicate the spelling. And as is the case with Buddhism, you're working in as many as like 4 or 5 languages. So knowing how what you're talking about is spelled is important for research purposes. So jhana has 2 different spellings. One is the Sanskrit version. The Sanskrit version is spelled D-H-Y long A in A in English. So that one will probably look the least familiar to most people who are familiar with this because that spelling is not as common whenever discussing these Buddhist doctrines. Sanskrit is typically not used as much as Pali is when discussing Buddhism words. The second spelling that you'll come across is the Pali spelling, which is J-H long A N A. Like I said, that one is the more common one because we've typically moved towards using the Pali words, the Pali spellings, the Pali pronunciations for Buddhism words in scholarship and in our colloquial terms.
Yeah, I tried to confirm this before we recorded this just because I had seen the term jhana mentioned in other meetings about Buddhism that I've had, but I always saw it spelled with a J. And I can tell you from experience, if you do not know the H is supposed to be there, Google has no idea what you're talking about.
Yeah, the H is vitally important.
Yeah, I tried several spellings trying to confirm this on my own, and I didn't realize the H was supposed to be there. Google had no idea what I was talking about. So, wanted to get that out so we could perhaps spare listeners some of the searching I ended up doing.
Absolutely.
So there's a phrase you used in there that I would like to poke at a little bit. What does it mean to abandon a jhana?
Yeah, it means to overcome that jhana. The reason is that all of these jhanas still carry a form of attachment with them, and they carry a form of karmic action with them. Equanimity is a good feeling. It's definitely something that people practice and strive for. However, equanimity is still a mental karmic action. We've talked about before how, due to the way that Buddhism views the mind and the universe around the mind, these feelings and thoughts and emotions we have are actually conscious, deliberate actions of the mind. So even though equanimity is a good one, it's a wholesome one, it's still a karmic belief. It's still a karmic feeling. And thus, we want to overcome karmic feelings and achieve a karmic or non-karmic existence in the form of nirvana and enlightenment.
The 4th step here was described as purity of equanimity and mindfulness. So that's the ultimate goal, right?
I would argue that the 4th jhana is actually not enlightenment. So These are all states that lead to enlightenment through repeated practice, but the 4th one is not the final one. In fact, though these are laid out as though one leads into the other, they can actually be very randomly ordered, and you can go up and down from one to the other. And in fact, on the Buddha's deathbed, before he passes away into his final nirvana, according to the Nirvana Sutra, he actually goes up and down in these, from the 1st to the 3rd, to the 4th, to the 2nd, to the 1st again. A couple of times he goes back and forth through these. There's a very complicated reason as to why, which we can discuss whenever we read and discuss the Nirvana Sutra. But all that to say that these are practices to be cultivated rather than a path with a destination.
Gotcha. Okay. All right. So let's talk a little bit about how it differs from other Buddhist schools.
Yes, so let's start with Chinese Chan, because that's critical to the development of Japanese Zen. Chinese Chan differs from early Buddhist schools and other Mahayana schools in that it pushes the doctrines of emptiness, non-duality, expedient means, and mind-to-mind transmission of the teaching to their farthest conceptual limits, using sutras such as the Heart Sutra, the Malakirti Sutra, and the Lankavatara Sutra as their scriptural basis for doing so. There's a lot of complicated terms in here that we could spend entire episodes on, and we probably will spend entire episodes on. So just hang on while you can. Additionally, these schools, the Chan schools, strongly emphasize the doctrine of Tathagata Garbha, which is a Sanskrit word for Buddha nature. This doctrine holds that all beings, with no exceptions, including non-sentient beings, have the potential to become not just arhats, not just bodhisattvas, but Buddhas. Japanese Zen takes these concepts up as well, but synthesizes them and develops them even more in the context of Japanese religion. My favorite Zen thinker, Dogen, who lived in Japan in the 13th century, has written extensively on Zen doctrine and philosophy, the nature of enlightenment, and how to properly meditate. We will be reading and discussing passages from his seminal work, the Shobo Genzo, in future episodes. In short, they employ a great deal of unique and controversial methods to induce enlightenment or realization, such as nonsense phrases and unsolvable riddles in the forms of koans, or slapping somebody across the face, beating them with a stick, showering them in ice water, etc. So they go to the extreme radical end of sudden enlightenment, or satori, as it's called in Japanese, trying to induce awakening in this very body, in this very life, using rather extreme means.
These look like they are slipping into the domain of abuse, even depending on like beating with a stick at that point. Like, how are we talking about injuries here?
So when I refer to beating with a stick, I'm thinking in particular of some Japanese Zen temples where the routine is like this. They wake up at 5 a.m. and they take their showers, their daily showers, in ice water. And I should mention also that these temples are in places that are very cold in the mountains. After they bathe in ice water, they go and they sit and do meditation, after eating, of course, for the entire 12-hour day, with only short breaks for meals and only short breaks to go and discuss and debate the scriptures with their Zen master. That's a very ritualized and almost highly scripted interaction where these koans are put to use, or these nonsense phrases or unsolvable riddles are put to use. And so while they're meditating, there's this character who walks back and forth with a paddle, like a very skinny paddle. His purpose is to hit anybody in the shoulder pretty hard, not hard enough to break their shoulder or to really, really hurt them, but a really hard slap in the shoulder. If he thinks that they're slouching in their posture, if he thinks that their mindfulness is not appropriate or strong enough, if their concentration's not strong enough, or he's also encouraged to just do it to people randomly. Because these tough conditions, they believe, they bring you mentally and emotionally within an inch of your life. And they're conflating being in this state of being within an inch of your life with being within an inch of losing your sense of self. If you can overcome the bodily feelings and emotional feelings that come along with these, like you say, these abuses, then you've overcome fully, to the most extreme degree, your sense of self. And that's what we're trying to do here, is we're trying to realize the truth of emptiness. Sometimes people claim that being showered in ice water or being slapped with a stick causes some sort of aha moment, some sort of realization. For example, those who have maybe been suddenly, surprisingly showered in ice water, or people who have bumped into something by accident. Sometimes they say they have a spectacular moment of clarity in that extreme sensory moment where they kind of go beyond what they're feeling mentally. And that's the experience they're going for.
Interesting. I've never experienced the realization from those kinds of sensations before, so I have a hard time relating, I suppose. But
I would say that I have had some realizations from stuff like that, but never to that extreme degree. Part of what got me into Asian studies was training in Japanese martial arts. And a lot of my undergrad research was dedicated to explaining and defining and writing about how some Japanese martial arts, such as Aikido, which is the one that I practiced, have a lot of shared concepts and experiences with Zen Buddhism and with the other major religion of Japan, Shinto. What I found was that making this a group activity where it's not just you alone. It's actually all of you in a group committed to the same goal. And whenever the practice bears some other kind of result in addition to this sudden enlightenment, all of those things combine to actually do kind of hone your mind in a way. Because what they're doing is training their bodies and their minds to transcend being carried away by being extra cold or extra hot or in this or that amount of pain. I found that whenever training for, oh my gosh, I must have trained for about 8 or 9 hours a day whenever I was in Japan. After doing that all day, I completely lost my sense of individuality in a good way, because I was part of something that was larger than what I was feeling and what I was doing individually. And in that sense, I think they're trying to maximize that experience. They're trying to maximize, through these harsh conditions, through this hard training regimen, the feeling of loss of self. It takes a lot of training and a lot of getting over the initial pain and suffering of it. But once you get there, it does feel pretty good. It does feel like you're on the right track with something. However, I should qualify all of this with something that might be obvious to you, to those listening, that this is all very ableist. There is not a lot of room for disability in this kind of training, because you have to have such a strong physical constitution. You have to be able to be healthy and be able to survive in very cold, harsh environments under very harsh conditions. Those who are not able to handle the ice water or the paddle on the shoulder or sitting upright meditating for 9, 10, 12 hours a day, unfortunately, some Zen temples in Japan will turn you away on those grounds, because that's exactly what the training is. That's what it's for. And so there is an ableist overtone to everything.
Yeah, my back injury makes it so that I can't sit for more than 30 minutes without being in pain. Being told to do that for hours at a time, that's literal torture for me. So yeah, that's a problem for me, at least. But also the idea of losing one's individuality in a group activity, I got that from symphonic band in high school.
Yeah, there's lots of ways to get that.
Yeah, that makes more sense to me now. Okay. There was one other term that we use a couple of times now that I want to dig in on a little bit, and that's mind-to-mind teaching. What does that mean?
Yeah, so this is a contentious issue in the scholarship of Zen Buddhism, and often also in the scripture used around Zen Buddhism. Zen Buddhists claim, and Chan Buddhists claim, that describing or teaching enlightenment is like describing the flavor of chocolate to somebody who's never had chocolate before. How do you tell someone who's never eaten chocolate what chocolate tastes like? Similarly, if someone is blind, how do you tell them what color purple is like? The idea is that because of the limitations of language, the true essence of the teaching must be communicated from the mind of the teacher to the mind of the student. And Zen claims to emphasize that, claims to have some sort of way to do that, some methodologies for doing that. However, many scholars recently have started to say that Zen Buddhism claims to de-emphasize language because of the limitations of language move to other types of practice. However, koans, or these nonsense riddles and these controversial phrases and nonsense phrases, these things are absolutely emphasized heavily. And in addition to that, recitation of sutras and all the rituals that go along with that are all also still encouraged. So Zen Buddhism doesn't have a negative view of language because they have this mind-to-mind transmission teaching. The koans are a huge tradition. Many of the most popular koans that you might have heard of could be like, what's the sound of one hand clapping?
Yep, that's the one that I always think of when I hear the word koan.
Exactly, yeah. There's lots of interesting ones out there used as meditation tools. The way they function is actually to use language to get to the part of the teaching that's ineffable or not transmissible by language. So they're de-emphasizing maybe direct language, where you say enlightenment is ABC. And instead, they're just giving you the ABC part and letting you do the rest. if that makes sense.
Okay, yeah, that does make sense. So let's get back to Zen Buddhism. What are its origins, and how does it reinterpret the earliest teachings?
Zen is said to originate with the Buddha's disciple Mahakāssyapa and the Flower Sermon. This is a very famous sermon, a very famous episode in what you might call Buddhist mythology, where the Buddha is preaching, and in the process of preaching, he picks up a white flower, and none of the disciples know what's going on. The Buddha has stopped talking, he stopped doing anything, he just picks up a flower with the flower pointing at his disciples. Everyone is stumped except for Mahakāssyapa, who smiles at this flower. This is said to represent the first mind-to-mind transmission teaching of the Buddha. It's the first mind-to-mind transmission of the teaching of the incommunicable reality of things, or their suchness. In Sanskrit, the word for suchness is tatata, which is related to this Tathagata Garbha word that we used earlier. So in that sermon, after Mahakāssyapa smiles at the flower, the Buddha praises him and explains everything that just happened and tells all the other disciples this is what you should be gunning for. To that end, Mahakāssyapa becomes the first patriarch of Zen. Zen, like other Mahayana schools, goes to a great deal of effort to legitimize their teaching through the use of lineages. This is a component of East Asian culture that has interacted and blended with Buddhism and Buddhist doctrine over the years. So this patriarch is the first major scholar of Zen Buddhism, and then he has disciples of several different branches, and their disciples have disciples, and on and on and on it goes, and thus a lineage is used to legitimize the teaching and legitimize the institution that you're learning from at the time. You can say that my teacher is a direct descendant of Mahakāssyapa. My teacher is a direct descendant of this person or that person. Other famous patriarchs of Zen that might be familiar to you would be Hui Neng, who is the sixth patriarch of Zen. Maybe also Dogen, who's another patriarch of Japanese Zen, who we mentioned earlier. There's one who's really interesting to me, who's called Bodhidharma. Bodhidharma is this South Asian guy who decided that he wasn't satisfied with all of the teachings of Buddhism up to this point. So in order to find and understand the real, true reality of things, he retreated to a cave, and he stared at the cave wall for 9 years without stopping. At one point during this practice, he fell asleep. And when he woke up, he was so upset and angry that he had fallen asleep, he decided to cut off his eyelids so that he would never fall asleep again. And he could continue to watch wall television for as long as it took. And there's many sutras and many other documents which document people trying to become a student of his, people trying to challenge his mindfulness, etc., etc. And he never stops meditating on the cave wall, trying to understand the truth, the reality, the suchness of things. That is an early precedent for some of these harsh teachings that we see today. Some of these harsh circumstances with meditating for hours and hours and hours and doing things that seem nonsensical, like looking at a wall all day to try and understand the reality of things. So all that to say, this whole lineage of patriarchs is said to have developed in China, Korea, and Japan after that. As a general rule, Zen reinterprets the earlier teachings and everything in the world in terms of emptiness. The Four Noble Truths, the Eightfold Path, morality, enlightenment, nirvana, the Buddha himself, all are empty according to this shunyata that we've talked about, according to Zen Buddhists. This, as we have discussed, doesn't mean that they don't exist or did not exist, at least provisionally, nor does it mean that they are meaningless in some nihilistic or fatalistic way. It simply means that they don't have permanent existence, and we can't think of them as having a real, unchanging, permanent self, because that would be a delusion. That would imply that we have permanent, unchanging selves, and Buddhism rejects that notion. So, according to Zen Buddhism, perfecting and internalizing the knowledge of the truth of emptiness through meditation, or through a nonsense phrase, or through some sort of other harsh circumstance, like having ice water dumped on you, or being slapped on the shoulder really hard during your meditation for years and years and years. All of that is one of the means to attaining enlightenment.
Okay. This might be off base, and if it is, we'll edit it out. But I'm wondering how these extreme practices in Zen Buddhism square with the middle path. These folks seem to be going to extremes. Haven't we talked about not going to extremes before?
You're right to ask that question. That is a strong critique of Zen Buddhism. Other schools often say they're going too far. Other schools often say that you can reach enlightenment in much easier ways, in much less extreme ways. However, I would also say that the middle way, it doesn't just apply to practice. The practical side is, of course, you shouldn't starve yourself and become a full ascetic, and you shouldn't indulge yourself in any kind of way, because those are two extremes, and real physical and mental health on the path, according to the Buddhist perspective, is the happy medium. However, there's also the conceptual and the philosophical extremes. So those extremes would be nothing exists at all versus everything exists permanently and in some unchanging way. The truth of emptiness is very much in the middle. And the Zen response to the critique of being too extreme is that, first off, they're not starving themselves or indulging themselves in some kind of physical way, nor are they going to conceptual ends. They're trying to use extreme means to get to the middle way. And they have some basis for making that claim. There is some scriptural basis for using both ends of a duality to achieve an understanding of non-duality. You have to understand good, you have to understand bad before you can understand that good and bad are a duality to be overcome, and that the real true ethical or moral position exists somewhere in the middle of those. So there's a lot of critique, and you're right to bring that up, and it's not easily solved, and it's still kind of an ongoing critique to this day. Another critique, of course, is like, if you're whacking somebody, then that's violence. And the first rule, the first precept of Buddhism is non-violence. And the response to that is that Buddhist doctrine has been reinterpreted and reinterpreted and reinterpreted and reinterpreted over and over again by the time it gets to Japanese Zen. And so they don't think of non-violence as not whacking someone to help them reach enlightenment. Oftentimes, violence is actually recorded or maybe understood or perceived as a means of enlightening somebody, according to this concept, which we haven't discussed that much, called skillful means. Basically, if violence occurs, it can be interpreted as a skillful means to enlighten people who witness it. Basically, you witness violence and you suddenly don't want to be violent anymore. That's the idea behind using violence as a skillful means. Or similarly, violence could be a means to send a person to nirvana, according to those who want to justify their violence. For example, warriors on the battlefield oftentimes would say that they were making their enemies into Buddhas because they were killing them and sending them out of samsara into nirvana. So to that end, violence and killing has taken on very much a new position in the philosophy because of this truth of emptiness and the middle way. Killing is not all bad, nor is it all good. Violence is not all bad, nor is it all good. It's all dependent on context, and the contexts are ever-changing and impermanent and empty. So then the position on violence and killing is impermanent and empty. So it's all a radical, late-stage reinterpretation of the original Buddhist doctrine. And that's not to say that it's a misinterpretation or a misrepresentation. That's not for me to say. But it's definitely taking some concepts from early Buddhism to extreme degrees to reinterpret others. That's kind of what we'll see as we talk about other schools in the development of Mahayana Buddhism.
All right. All of that makes sense to me. So, all right. Well, that concludes this episode on Zen Buddhism. And so let's talk a bit about next week. We are going to discuss the issues of gender in Buddhism? How does gender function in Buddhism? What is the doctrinal basis for that status? How does that change over time? See you next time. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you for listening. See you next time. My name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions and the voice of Hearer.
And I'm Docs, editor, question asker, and voice of Hermit.
And this has been Bright on Buddhism. Thank you for listening. If you like our podcast, or if you have a question you'd like us to discuss, we'd love to hear from you. Please consider leaving a comment or review, subscribing, or joining us on social media. Our email is bright.on.buddhism@gmail.com.
You can find us on Twitter at Bright Buddhism.
As always, citations and resources for this episode can be found in the show notes. Thank you.